The sun ruthlessly punished the small town of Dry Creek Valley. Golden rays penetrated the arid earth like sharp needles, absorbing any trace of moisture. Anthony Silver watched his farm from the porch of his simple house. His tired eyes scanned the once green fields, now transformed into a yellowed and sterile landscape. At 55 years old, Anthony carried in his face the marks of time and the constant struggle against drought. His calloused hands held a coffee cup while he contemplated the old barn that had once housed abundant harvests. Now, only a skeleton of faded wood remained as a reminder of prosperous times. "Will it rain today, Mr. Anthony?" asked Joshua, the young helper, who was passing by the porch carrying tools. Anthony took a deep breath, feeling the dry air burn his lungs. "Not today, son. The clouds are distant. Maybe next week." It was what he'd been saying for months. Hope, like rain, seemed increasingly distant. Anthony's small farm sat on the outskirts of town, sufficiently isolated for him to feel solitude as a constant companion. Since Connie, his wife, had left for the capital seeking medical treatment 3 years ago, Anthony had been retreating more and more into his own world. Her letters had become rarer until they ceased completely. On that Thursday morning, Anthony decided to go to the town's monthly livestock fair. Not that he could afford to buy anything valuable, but the fair was a meeting point for ranchers in the region, the place where news circulated, where rain predictions, supply prices, and stories from the area were discussed. "I'm going to the fair, Joshua. Take care of the chickens and check the fence on the north side." The young man nodded positively as Anthony grabbed his worn straw hat and headed to the old pickup truck. The engine coughed several times before finally coming to life, protesting as if sharing its owner's weariness. The dirt road leading to town was rutted, beaten by the merciless sun. During the journey, Anthony observed the other properties. Some, like his, fought against the aridity. Others, belonging to wealthier ranchers, displayed modern irrigation systems that maintained islands of green amid a sea of dry earth. The fair bustled in the center of small Dry Creek Valley. Colorful stalls spread across the central square, creating a labyrinth of products, animals, and people. The strong smell of livestock mixed with the aroma of typical foods prepared in food stalls. Voices intertwined in a constant buzzing. Negotiations, gossip, laughter, and laments about the drought. "Anthony Silver, how long has it been?" exclaimed Sebastian Mendez, a neighboring rancher. "Thought you'd been swallowed by the dust from your farm." Anthony smiled discreetly, shaking his friend's calloused hand. "The dust tries, Sebastian, but I still resist. And how's the planting?" Anthony shook his head negatively. "There's no planting, just hope that one day there will be again." The two men walked together among the stalls, occasionally stopping to greet acquaintances or observe the displayed livestock. Anthony felt out of place among those who could still maintain their functioning businesses. His pride prevented him from admitting how difficult it was becoming to survive on the little he could still produce. It was when, turning at one of the fair's extremities, Anthony saw the goat. Tied to an old post, the skinny animal looked as out of place as himself. Its coat was dull, its ribs visible under the thin skin, but it was its eyes that captured Anthony's attention. There was something in that gaze, an intensity, an intelligence that seemed to defy its miserable condition. "How much for the goat?" Anthony asked the vendor, a fat man who chewed on a toothpick with disinterest. $100. "Say it's old, but still good for meat." Anthony felt a tightening in his chest. He hadn't planned to buy anything, much less an animal that would probably need care. But something inexplicable urged him on. Those eyes. "70, Anthony negotiated. Feeling sweat drip down his forehead. "80 and we have a deal," the vendor responded, already untying the rope restraining the animal. When Anthony returned to his pickup with the goat in the cargo area, even he didn't fully understand what he'd done. He only knew that somehow he felt connected to that animal, as if, among so many lives beaten down by drought, they had found in each other a reflection of their own resistance. What Anthony couldn't imagine was that this goat, apparently ordinary, would be the starting point for unearthing secrets deeply rooted in Dry Creek Valley's history. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us from which city you're watching us. Continuing. The return to the farm was silent. The goat remained motionless in the truck's cargo area, its attentive eyes observing the arid landscape passing by. Anthony occasionally glanced in the rearview mirror, intrigued by the animal's calmness. Most animals would get agitated, but not this one. There was an almost disturbing serenity in its posture. "Now what? What am I going to do with you?" murmured Anthony to himself. When he finally parked in his farm's yard, Joshua appeared, surprised to see the new inhabitant of the property. "A goat, Mr. Anthony. We don't even have enough food for the other animals." I know," he responded, running his hand over his neck. It was an impulse. He was there, alone, looked like he'd waste away if he stayed with that vendor. The young helper approached the animal cautiously while Anthony opened the truck door. To both their surprise, the goat descended calmly without needing to be pulled or pushed. Once on the ground, it looked around, as if evaluating its new home. "He has a strange look," Joshua commented, "like he's analyzing us." Anthony nodded, feeling again that inexplicable connection. There was something about that animal that escaped normalcy. "Let's put him in the small corral for now. I'll get some water and the rest of that hay left from last month." In the following days, the goat demonstrated peculiar behaviors. Unlike the other farm animals, it seemed to carefully select what it ate, rejecting certain plants Anthony offered. During the day, it wandered the terrain, always stopping at specific points, as if searching for something. At night, it didn't sleep in the makeshift shelter Anthony had prepared, preferring to lie under the stars in the farthest corner of the property. "Haven't you given him a name yet?" Joshua asked on the morning of the 5th day. Anthony, who was watching the animal from afar, frowned. "I don't know if it should have a name. Don't even know if it'll stay." But Anthony knew he was lying to himself. Something prevented him from getting rid of the goat, even though its presence represented another mouth to feed in times of scarcity. The following week, a fine, quick rain fell on Dry Creek Valley. It wasn't enough to relieve the drought, but brought a brief respite to the punished earth. It was that same night Anthony noticed the goat's absence. Worried, he went out with a flashlight into the darkness, calling for an animal that didn't even have a name. He found it the next morning, at the edge of a small grove that grew in the back of the farm, an area Anthony rarely visited because it was too rocky for cultivation. The goat was digging frantically, its front hooves scratching the earth with an almost obsessive determination. "What are you doing there?" Anthony asked, approaching cautiously. The animal stopped upon hearing the human voice, turning to face him with those disturbingly intelligent eyes. Then, as if wanting to show something, it returned to digging. Intrigued, Anthony knelt beside the goat. The earth was damp due to the previous night's rain, making excavation easier. When he began to help, using his hands to remove earth, he felt something solid. A chill ran down his spine when his fingers touched a smooth, cold surface. "What is this?" With growing curiosity and an inexplicable dread, Anthony continued digging until he fully revealed the object. A wooden box, darkened by time and moisture. It wasn't very large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but surprisingly heavy. The goat stepped back, observing from a distance while Anthony examined the mysterious discovery. The box was locked, but the lock, corroded by time, yielded easily when he applied some force. The interior revealed a set of old documents, yellowed and fragile. Many were damp and stained, but still legible. Anthony carefully removed each sheet, examining them with growing perplexity. There were detailed maps of the region, notes written in hurried handwriting, and newspaper clippings dated from the 70s. A name appeared repeatedly in the documents: Dr. Lawrence. Anthony had never heard of this man, which was strange considering he knew practically all the families in the region. The newspaper clippings reported a series of disappearances in the region during that period. Children who vanished without a trace, fruitless searches, theories about what could have happened. In one of the more recent clippings, a small note informed that investigations had been closed due to lack of evidence. "How did this get here?" murmured Anthony, turning to the goat, which remained motionless, watching him. It was then that a distant memory nudged Anthony's mind. His father, now deceased, used to talk about a strange period in Dry Creek Valley's history, when inexplicable things happened. At the time, Anthony was just a boy and didn't pay much attention to those stories, considering them exaggerations of an elderly man. But now, with evidence in his hands, his father's words gained new weight. Carefully gathering the documents, Anthony closed the box. The goat, as if its mission were complete, calmly walked away toward the farm. Anthony followed it, carrying the box under his arm, his mind buzzing with questions. That discovery was just the beginning. Without Anthony knowing, he had just opened a door to a carefully buried past, a past that many in Dry Creek Valley preferred to keep hidden. And the goat, that apparently ordinary animal he had bought on impulse at the fair, seemed to be the key to unraveling these mysteries. "I think I'll call you Sheriff," Anthony said to the animal when they reached the house. "Seems you have a talent for unearthing secrets." The morning rain had given way to a clear dawn. In his modest kitchen, Anthony spread the found documents on the wooden table worn by time. The goat, now named Sheriff, slept peacefully in the corner of the porch, as if having fulfilled its mission. With careful fingers, Anthony separated the papers by type: maps, notes, and newspaper clippings. The maps showed Dry Creek Valley and its surroundings, but with strange markings at specific locations, red circles, numbers, and codes he couldn't decipher. One of the maps had an X marked precisely where his farm now stood. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, rubbing his tired face. The notes were even more enigmatic. Written by hand in hurried handwriting, they contained observations like, "Subject 7, positive reaction to sound stimulus or sample B12, promising results after 48 hours. Technical terms Anthony didn't understand, mixed with city locations he knew well. But it was the newspaper clippings that really captured his attention. Dated between 1972 and 1975, they reported the disappearance of 12 children in the region. The sensationalist headlines contrasted with the small amount of concrete information. "Another child mysteriously disappears in Dry Creek. Authorities puzzled by disappearances. Desperate parents demand answers." In all the articles, Dr. E.C. Lawrence's name appeared, sometimes as a consulted source, others as someone involved in the searches. According to the reports, he was a respected scientist who had come to the region to conduct research on local fauna and ended up getting involved in the investigations due to his expertise. One clipping particularly caught Anthony's attention. It was a small footnote in a 1975 newspaper. "Investigations closed due to lack of evidence. Dr. Lawrence returns to capital after concluding his studies in the region." The date coincided with the end of reports about disappearances. "Joshua," Anthony called when he heard the young helper arriving. The boy entered the kitchen, surprised to see the table covered with old papers. "What's all this, Mr. Anthony?" "Something Sheriff found buried in the back of the property." He paused, hesitant. "Have you ever heard of a Dr. Lawrence?" Joshua frowned, thoughtful. "Lawrence. My grandfather mentioned that name sometimes. Said he was a man from the big city who did experiments with animals here in the region." "Why do you ask?" Anthony indicated the spread documents. "Because it seems he was involved in something strange that happened here in the 70s, something related to missing children." Joshua's eyes widened. "My grandfather talked about that too. Said it was a complicated time that some parents sent their children to live with relatives in other cities, out of fear. But I never really understood what had happened. He always changed the subject when I asked for more details." The information confirmed Anthony's suspicions. Something serious had occurred in Dry Creek Valley, something the community preferred to forget over the years. "I need to find out more about this Dr. Lawrence," Anthony said, determined, "and about these animal experiments." "Why not talk to Mr. Carl? He was a policeman here in the region for more than 30 years. If anyone knows what happened back then, it's him." Carl Sanders was a known figure in Dry Creek Valley. Retired for 10 years, the ex-cop now spent his days in his small house near the central square, watching the town's movement from his chair on the porch. Anthony knew him superficially, from occasional encounters at the fair or local store. "I'll go there today," Anthony decided. In the meantime, don't tell anyone about what we found, understood? Not about the goat, nor about the box." Joshua nodded, visibly intrigued by the mystery. "You can count on me, Mr. Anthony. I'll be a tomb." After feeding the few animals he still had, and checking the small garden he maintained for subsistence, Anthony prepared to go to town. He hesitated about what to do with the found documents, finally deciding to take only some newspaper clippings, and leaving the maps and notes hidden between the ceiling and roof of the house. Before leaving, he observed Sheriff, who now rested in the shade of a withered tree. The animal seemed different. Its coat, once dull, already showed signs of recovery, and its eyes, though maintaining that strange intensity, seemed more alive. "You're staying here today," Anthony said, as if the goat could understand him. "I have business to handle in town." The animal looked at him for a few moments, then closed its eyes again, indifferent. Anthony couldn't help feeling the goat knew exactly what he planned to do. Carl Sanders' small house was easily recognizable by the collection of potted plants decorating the porch, a contrast to the aridity dominating the region. The ex-cop was in his usual chair, smoking a pipe while observing the sparse street traffic. "Anthony Silver," he exclaimed upon seeing the rancher approaching. "To what do I owe this visit? Don't tell me the drought finally kicked you off that farm." Anthony forced a smile, extending his hand to greet the older man. "Not yet, Carl. The land is stubborn, but I'm more so." "So what brings you here?" asked the ex-cop, indicating the empty chair beside him. "You've never been one for social visits." Anthony sat down, unsure how to approach the subject. Finally, he decided on honesty. "I'm trying to understand something that happened here in Dry Creek in the 70s, something related to missing children and a Dr. Lawrence." The smile disappeared from Carl's face. His eyes, once friendly, became serious, almost defensive. "Where? Did you hear that name?" he asked in a low voice, looking around as if fearing being overheard. "I found some old documents," Anthony responded, avoiding mentioning the goat and the exact circumstances of the discovery. "Newspaper clippings talking about disappearances." His name appeared several times. Carl took a long draw from his pipe, slowly releasing the smoke while seeming to ponder his response. "Those are old stories, Anthony. Things the town preferred to forget." He made a significant pause. "Why are you digging this up now?" The choice of the word digging didn't go unnoticed by Anthony. There was something in the ex-cop's posture, a tension that didn't match his usual tranquility. "Because I have a feeling these old stories might still have consequences today," Anthony responded, determined not to back down. "And because I sense there's more to this story than people wanted to tell." Carl's eyes met Anthony's, assessing him silently. Finally, the ex-cop sighed deeply. "You've always been a stubborn man, Anthony. Maybe that's why you still haven't given up on that farm." He tapped his pipe to remove the ashes. "All right. Come see me tomorrow at noon. Maybe I'll have some things to tell you about Dr. Lawrence and his experiments." The night was restless for Anthony. His dreams were populated by disconnected images, children running in dry dirt fields, a man in a white coat watching them from a distance, and Sheriff, the goat, guiding him through unknown paths. He woke before dawn, sweaty with a sense of urgency he couldn't explain. Stepping out to the yard while still in darkness, he found Sheriff standing completely still, staring at the horizon. The animal seemed to be in a trance, its eyes fixed on some distant point. When Anthony approached, the goat didn't even move. "What are you seeing, huh?" he murmured, following the direction of the animal's gaze. There was nothing but the usual landscape, the arid terrain, some trees resistant to drought, and the dirt road leading to town. Even so, Anthony felt a chill. The goat's posture conveyed a disturbing certainty, as if watching something human eyes couldn't perceive. At 11:30, Anthony was already on his way to Carl's house. The merciless midday sun made the town seem deserted, with most residents taking refuge in the shade of their homes. He arrived a few minutes before the agreed time and found the ex-cop sitting on his porch as the day before, but with a more grave expression. "Come in," Carl said without the usual cordiality. "It's better we talk inside." The interior of the house was surprisingly organized. Simple but well-maintained furniture decorated the living room. On the walls, Old photographs showed Carl in his police uniform alongside other men at different times. "Sit," the ex-cop indicated, pointing to a worn armchair. "Want coffee? Water?" "Water, please," Anthony responded, feeling his throat dry not just from the walk under the sun. Carl left for a few minutes and returned with 2 glasses of water. Then he removed a cardboard box from a cabinet and placed it on the coffee table. "What exactly do you know about Dr. Lawrence?" he asked, sitting across from Anthony. "Only what was in the newspaper clippings. That he was a scientist who came to the region to study local fauna and somehow got involved in investigations about missing children." Carl let out a humorless laugh. "That was the official version, yes." He opened the box, revealing more newspaper clippings, photographs, and documents. "But the truth is quite different. Dr. Robert Lawrence didn't come to Dry Creek Valley to study fauna. He came because the government of that time sponsored his research project, and this region, isolated and impoverished, was the perfect place to conduct it without many curious eyes." Anthony felt his stomach drop. There was something in Carl's voice, a weight that indicated what was to come wouldn't be pleasant. What was this project? Carl pulled a photograph from the box and handed it to Anthony. In it, a middle-aged man with graying hair and penetrating eyes posed beside a construction that looked like an improvised laboratory. In the background, several cages could be seen. Dr. Lawrence was interested in the relationship between animals and humans, specifically in certain animals' ability to perceive things we cannot. Carl paused, as if carefully choosing his words. He believed animals like dogs, cats, and curiously goats had a special sensitivity to what he called paranormal events. Anthony frowned. Paranormal? Like ghosts? Among other things, Lawrence was convinced that animals could sense the presence of, well, he used terms like entities or energy manifestations, but his real interest was in these animals' ability to locate people. Like tracker dogs. Not exactly. Carl took a sip of water. He wanted to prove that animals could find people even without physical clues, even when there were no trails to follow. And to test this theory, he needed volunteers. Anthony's stomach contracted further. The missing children. Carl nodded gravely. At first, he used legitimate volunteers. Parents who allowed their children to participate in hide-and-seek games with the trained animals in exchange for small amounts of money. But then, the experiments became more complex, more demanding. And the authorities? Didn't anyone question? "I did." Carl's voice trembled slightly. "I was just a rookie cop back then, but I noticed there was something wrong with Lawrence's explanations for increasingly frequent disappearances. But the mayor at the time, Jerome Davis, protected Lawrence. The research brought money to the town, created jobs. Anthony vaguely remembered the former mayor, an authoritarian man who governed Dry Creek Valley for almost 20 years. His son, Ernest Davis, was the current mayor, having inherited not only the name but also his father's influence. "What happened to the children?" Anthony asked, fearing the answer. Carl stared at him for a long time before responding. "Officially, they were never found. The searches were closed for lack of evidence. Lawrence returned to the capital, the laboratory was dismantled, and the town moved on, pretending nothing had happened." "And unofficially?" The ex-cop sighed deeply. "Unofficially there are. Rumors that not all children disappeared. Some may have been different after participating in the experiments. Others may have been taken to continue studies elsewhere." He paused. "And some say that some may have been replaced." "Replaced?" Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "It's hard to explain." Carl seemed uncomfortable. "Lawrence's experiments messed with things we don't fully understand. He believed there was a connection between certain animals and what he called the spiritual plane. A connection that could be strengthened and manipulated." Anthony's mind immediately turned to Sheriff and his strange behavior. The way the animal had guided him to the buried box, his unusually intelligent eyes, his ability to seem to understand what was happening around him. And the animals? What happened to them after the experiments were terminated? Most were sacrificed when the laboratory was closed. Again, that hesitation in Carl's voice. But there were rumors that some were kept alive, hidden, to continue the studies in secret. A disturbing thought crossed Anthony's mind. Carl, Lawrence's experiments. Did they happen where my farm is now? The ex-cop seemed surprised. How do you know that? One of the maps I found marked my property with an X. Carl nodded slowly. Yes, the main laboratory was in that area. After Lawrence left, the site was abandoned for years, until your father bought the property in the 80s and built the farm. He frowned. But how did you find those documents? I thought everything had been destroyed or taken when the laboratory was dismantled. Anthony hesitated. Telling about Sheriff meant potentially exposing an animal linked to Lawrence's experiments, which could put him at risk. On the other hand, Carl seemed to be the only person willing to speak openly about the past. I bought a goat at the fair recently, he said finally, an old animal with different eyes. It was he who found the buried box. Carl's eyes widened. Goat? He leaned forward, suddenly alert. What's he like? Skinny when I bought him, coat without shine, but his eyes have an uncommon intelligence, and he behaves strangely, as if looking for something. The ex-cop stood up abruptly, going to a drawer from which he retrieved another photograph. He handed it to Anthony with trembling hands. Is this the animal? The photo, yellowed by time, showed a young goat in a cage. Despite the age difference, Anthony immediately recognized the eyes, the same penetrating eyes that now observed him at his farm. Yes, he responded, feeling his mouth go dry. That's Sheriff, but this is impossible and the photo must be almost 50 years old. Carl slumped back in the armchair, pale. It's not impossible. One of Lawrence's most controversial experiments involved techniques to prolong the lives of animals he considered special. He looked directly into Anthony's eyes. If that goat is really one of Lawrence's animals, you found something much more important than a simple box of old documents. You found a living witness to the experiments. The return to the farm was marked by heavy silence. Carl's revelation had shaken Anthony profoundly. The idea that Sheriff could be one of Lawrence's experimental animals, a survivor of something that happened nearly 5 decades ago, seemed absurd. However, it would explain the animal's strange behavior, its uncommon intelligence, and the way it had guided him to the buried documents. When he arrived at the property, it was already afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Joshua was finishing his daily tasks, closing the small corral where Anthony's few goats spent the night. How was the meeting with Mr. Carl? The young man asked. Curious. Anthony hesitated. He trusted Joshua, but the fewer people who knew about his investigation, the better. Enlightening, he responded vaguely. Where's Sheriff? That goat is strange, Mr. Anthony. He spent the whole day standing in front of the old barn as if waiting for something. I tried to move him, but he refused. Only when it was getting dark did he decide to come back near the house. The old barn was an abandoned structure in the back of the property. Anthony rarely went there since the place was practically in ruins, with the roof partially collapsed and wooden walls rotting. His father had planned to demolish it years ago, but never got around to it. Thanks, Joshua. You can go home now. We'll talk tomorrow. When the helper left, Anthony went to look for Sheriff. He found the goat lying on the edge of the porch, apparently sleeping. But as soon as he approached, the animal opened its eyes, staring at him with that disturbing intensity. So you're older than you look, huh? Murmured Anthony, kneeling beside the animal. What did you see, Sheriff? What happened in that laboratory? The goat stood up slowly and began walking toward the abandoned barn. It stopped halfway, turning to Anthony as if inviting him to follow. Want to show me something there? He asked, feeling a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The sun had already set completely when Anthony, with a flashlight in hand, followed Sheriff to the barn. The structure, illuminated only by the weak light of the crescent moon, seemed even more threatening in the dark. The goat entered without hesitation, through an opening in the side wall, disappearing into the shadows. Anthony turned on the flashlight and followed it, having to duck to get through the opening. The interior smelled of rotten wood and dust. Old hay and rusty tools occupied corners, and spider webs decorated the exposed beams. Sheriff stood in the center of the barn, staring fixedly at the floor. "What is it? What's there?" Anthony asked, approaching. Illuminating the area with the flashlight, he noticed the floor in that specific place was different. While the rest of the barn had a packed dirt floor, that area was covered by dark wooden planks. Kneeling, Anthony ran his hand over the planks, feeling they were loose. With growing excitement, he began removing the planks one by one. Under them, a metal trap door, painted the same color as earth for camouflage, revealed itself. A small ring served as a handle. "My God," he murmured, realizing he was about to discover something that had remained hidden for decades. With considerable effort, he managed to open the trap door. A current of cold air, smelling of mold and old chemicals, rose from the dark hole. A metal ladder descended into the darkness. Anthony hesitated. Entering an unknown basement, guided only by a goat possibly related to questionable scientific experiments, didn't seem like a sensible idea. But his curiosity was stronger than fear. "Are you coming?" he asked Sheriff, who remained impassive beside him. The goat took a few steps back, as if indicating he wouldn't follow. Anthony understood the message. This journey was his alone. With Tinsao, the flashlight firmly held, he began descending the metal steps. They creaked under his weight but seemed sufficiently stable. When he reached the bottom of the ladder, he found himself in a narrow corridor with concrete walls. The air was heavy, difficult to breathe. The corridor led to a larger room. When Anthony illuminated the environment with his flashlight, he couldn't contain an exclamation of surprise. It was a complete laboratory, intact, as if it had been abandoned in haste. Metal tables with old equipment, shelves full of bottles and documents, and, most disturbing, cages of different sizes aligned against one of the walls. "Lawrence's laboratory," he whispered, still incredulous. "How did this stay here, all this time, without anyone discovering it?" While exploring the place, Anthony began to understand. The laboratory had been built underground, completely hidden. When the experiments were interrupted, only the entrance was camouflaged, and the rest was preserved, probably in case Lawrence returned someday to continue his work. On a central table, he found a leather-bound diary. Opening it carefully, he saw it was Dr. Lawrence's personal record. The first pages described his scientific objectives in formal terms, but as it progressed, the tone gradually changed, becoming almost obsessive. Day 127. Experiment 7. Male. Goat, 3 years, continues presenting extraordinary results. Its ability to locate hidden objects surpasses any conventional explanation. It's as if it could see through layers of reality inaccessible to us. Tomorrow we'll begin tests with Subject B. Anthony turned some pages. Day 142. Subject B. Boy. 8 years, was found by Experiment 7 in just 17 minutes, despite being hidden in a location the animal had never visited before. When questioned about how he knew where to look, Experiment 7 obviously couldn't respond, but its physical reaction, dilated pupils, increased heart rate, suggests an almost telepathic connection. Anthony's stomach turned. The missing. Children weren't just rumors. They were experimental subjects identified by letters as if they were mere study objects. He continued leafing through the diary, each page revealing more disturbing details about Lawrence's experiments. At a certain point, the scientist's writing became almost illegible, as if he were writing in a state of great agitation. Day 215. Something extraordinary happened. Experiment 7 not only located Subject F, who had been hidden in a sealed room, but seems to have established some sort of connection with him. The subject reports having seen through the goat's eyes moments before being found. This surpasses all my expectations. We're on the verge of proving that consciousness can transcend physical limits, that there can be communication beyond known senses. The following pages detailed how Lawrence intensified his experiments, testing the limits of the connection between the goat, which Anthony now knew was Sheriff, and the human subjects. The descriptions became increasingly disturbing, with mentions of unexpected behavioral alterations in subjects and manifestations of inexplicable abilities after prolonged sessions with the animal. The last entry was dated September 17, 1975. Davis is ending funding. Says there's too much pressure that he can no longer cover up the incidents, as if science could advance without risks. The laboratory will be closed, animals sacrificed, everything erased. But they don't understand what we discovered here. Experiment 7 is unique. The connection it established with subjects is something conventional science cannot explain. I cannot allow it to be destroyed. I'll make arrangements to hide it. One day, when the world is ready, we'll resume this work. Anthony closed the diary, feeling nauseated. What had begun as curiosity about old documents now revealed itself as something much darker. If the diary was correct, Sheriff wasn't just an exceptionally intelligent animal. He was the result of experiments that had violated all ethical principles, experiments that had used children as guinea pigs. The noise above startled him. Someone or something was in the barn. Quickly turning off the flashlight, Anthony remained motionless in the darkness, trying to control his accelerated breathing. Footsteps sounded on the wooden floor, approaching the open trapdoor. "Anthony, are you down there?" Joshua's familiar voice echoed through the space. "I saw your flashlight light coming from the old barn." Anthony breathed with relief. "I'm here, Joshua. Come down, but be careful with the ladder." While waiting. For the young helper, Anthony put the diary in the inner pocket of his jacket. Whatever had happened in that laboratory decades ago was something that needed to be fully understood before being shared, and for now, Sheriff was the only living connection to that obscure past. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us from which city you're watching us. Continuing. Joshua descended cautiously down the metal ladder, his expression of astonishment growing as his flashlight illuminated the underground laboratory. "My God, Mr. Anthony, what is this?" the young man exclaimed, slowly turning to absorb the sight of the place. "The hidden past of Dry Creek Valley," Anthony responded, still processing everything he had discovered. "Joshua, I need you to promise you won't tell anyone about this place, at least for now." The helper nodded, still stunned by the discovery. "But what is all this? It looks like something out of a science fiction movie." Anthony hesitated. How much should he tell the boy? Finally, he decided to share only the essentials. It was a secret laboratory in the 70s. A scientist named Dr. Lawrence conducted experiments here, many of them questionable. He paused, and I believe Sheriff was one of those experiments. Joshua's eyes widened even more. "That old goat? But that was 50 years ago. How is he still alive?" "That's exactly what I intend to find out." They spent the next hour exploring the laboratory. Besides the diary, they found folders with detailed records of the experiments, photographs of subjects, both animals and humans, and maps marked with specific locations in Dry Creek Valley and its surroundings. "Look at this, Mr. Anthony," Joshua called, pointing to a large map on the wall. "These marked points. One of them is the old abandoned train station." Anthony examined the map carefully. Indeed, several points were marked, including the train station, the city hall, a now deactivated school, and a well in the center of the square that had been closed for decades. "They were locations related to the experiments," murmured Anthony. "Perhaps points where the children were tested." A sudden thought struck him, making him quickly return to the diary. Leafing through the pages, he found what he was looking for: a list of coded names of human subjects, followed by their actual initials. Subject A, MD. Subject B, PS. Subject C, LM. Subject D, FS. Subject E, JR. Subject F, ED. Anthony felt a chill recognizing the initials ED. "Ernest Davis," he whispered, remembering Carl's words about the current mayor being the son of Jerome Davis, the man who had financed Lawrence's experiments. "What was it, Mr. Anthony?" Joshua asked, noticing his disturbed expression. "I think the current mayor might have been one of the experimental subjects," Anthony responded, his mind churning with implications. That would explain why his father, the former mayor, ended everything so abruptly. They continued exploring the laboratory, each discovery adding new pieces to the puzzle. In a locked cabinet, which Joshua managed to open using a rusty screwdriver, they found carefully labeled cassette tapes. "Bonding sessions," Joshua read aloud. "What do you think that means?" "I don't know, but we need to listen to these tapes." Anthony stored them along with the diary. "We've been here too long. Let's go back before someone notices our absence." Returning to the surface, they found Sheriff exactly where they had left him, watching them with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. "He knew," Anthony said, staring at the goat. "He brought us here on purpose." Joshua swallowed hard. "Mr. Anthony, this is all very strange. What do we do now? First, we'll keep everything safe. Then I need a recorder to listen to these tapes." The next day, after a night of restless sleep filled with disturbing dreams, Anthony woke with a strange feeling. Something was different. It took him a few minutes to realize what it was. For the first time since he bought him, Sheriff was nowhere to be seen. Worried, Anthony searched for the animal throughout the property, repeatedly calling his name. It was Joshua who finally found him, standing on the road leading to town as if waiting. "I think he wants to go to town, Mr. Anthony," the young man said, intrigued by the animal's behavior. Anthony contemplated the situation. The goat had found the buried box, guided him to the hidden laboratory. Perhaps now he wanted to show him something else. "I'll get the pickup," he decided. "And you, Joshua, stay here. If anyone comes asking for me, say I went to buy supplies." The journey to town was tense. Sheriff remained calm in the back of the pickup, but Anthony couldn't help glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, half expecting the animal to do something extraordinary at any moment. As they entered Dry Creek Valley, Anthony realized he didn't know where to go. He decided to drive slowly through the main streets, attentive to any reaction from Sheriff. When they passed the old abandoned train station on the outskirts of town, the goat began to get agitated, stamping its hooves on the truck bed. "This is where you want to stop?" murmured Anthony, parking in the shade of a withered tree. The station was a relic from an era when Dry Creek Valley had more regional importance. The railway lines had been deactivated in the 80s, and the building had been abandoned since then, its exposed brick walls peeling under the merciless sun, broken windows like empty eyes watching the desert growing around it. Anthony got out of the pickup and opened the back door. Sheriff jumped agilely, heading without hesitation to the station entrance. The main door was blocked by nailed boards, but there was a side opening partially hidden by dry bushes. "You really want me to go in there?" Anthony asked, feeling ridiculous for talking to an animal as if it could respond. Sheriff just stared at him with those deep eyes, then disappeared through the opening. Sighing, Anthony followed him, having to squeeze to get through the narrow gap between the boards. The interior of the station was a study in abandonment. Dust covered every surface, spiderwebs decorated corners, and the floor was speckled with broken glass from the windows. The main hall, which had once been the waiting area for passengers, was empty except for some benches of rotting wood. Sheriff crossed the hall and headed to an almost imperceptible door at the back. Anthony followed him, each step echoing in the sepulchral silence of the place. The door led to a narrow corridor, which in turn ended in a room that must have been the station master's office. The room was surprisingly better preserved than the rest of the building. A mahogany desk occupied the center, leather chairs cracked by time surrounded it, and bookshelves covered the walls. The most surprising thing, however, was that everything seemed to have been used recently. There wasn't the same layer of dust covering the rest of the station, and papers were carefully organized on the desk. "Someone has been using this place," murmured Anthony, examining the documents. They were handwritten notes, charts, and what appeared to be test results. A folder, labeled Bonding Project Continuation, caught his attention. Inside he found detailed reports about experiments conducted in the last 5 years, experiments that followed the same line as those performed by Lawrence decades before. "My God, they never stopped," he whispered, horrified. "They just changed locations." A noise from the corridor made him freeze. Footsteps approached. Quickly, Anthony looked for a place to hide, but the room offered few options. Sheriff, however, remained calmly in the center of the room, as if waiting for the visitor. The door opened and Anthony found himself face to face with a middle-aged man, grey hair and penetrating eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. The man didn't appear surprised. "Ah, finally you came," he said, looking not at Anthony but at the goat. "And brought a friend." "Who are you?" Anthony asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Raphael Lawrence, Jr." He paused, observing Anthony's reaction. "I see the name means something to you. Yes, I'm Dr. Lawrence's son. And you must be Anthony Silva, the man who bought my old friend at the fair." Anthony looked at Sheriff, who now stood between the two men, as if mediating a long-awaited encounter. "That goat, he belonged to your father." "Belonged is an inadequate word." Lawrence Jr.'s smile widened. N7, as we called him, was more a collaborator than property. And now it seems he chose you to continue the work. "Work? What work?" "The connection, Mr. Silva. The bridge between worlds that my father began to build, and that I have been perfecting over the years." Lawrence Jr. gestured to the documents on the desk. "With the involuntary help of our friend the mayor, of course. After all, some connections, once established, never break completely." Anthony felt his blood run cold. The presence of Raphael Lawrence Jr. completely changed the situation. He wasn't just investigating past events. He was in the middle of something that remained active, something potentially dangerous. "You're saying you continued your father's experiments?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady while his mind calculated the distance to the door. Lawrence Jr. indicated one of the chairs. "Please, sit, Mr. Silva. I believe we have much to discuss, and N7 wouldn't have brought you here if it wasn't important." Hesitant, Anthony sat down, keeping his eyes fixed on Lawrence. Sheriff, or N7 as the scientist called him, settled calmly between the two men, observing the scene with those disturbingly intelligent eyes. "I imagine you've found the underground laboratory on your property," Lawrence Jr. began, settling into the chair behind the desk, "and probably read my father's diary, so you must already have some idea of what we're dealing with here." Anthony hesitated. Revealing how much he knew could be dangerous, but feigning ignorance didn't seem like a viable option either. "I know your father conducted experiments with animals and children in Dry Creek Valley in the 70s, experiments to test some kind of paranormal connection." Lawrence Jr. smiled slightly. "Paranormal is a term science uses when it doesn't want to admit there are phenomena beyond its limited understanding. My father preferred the term transpersonal, something that transcends individual consciousness boundaries." He interlaced his fingers on the desk. "But yes, that's the essence. He discovered that certain animals, especially N7 here, possess a unique ability to establish mental bonds with humans. Not just locate people in hide-and-seek games, but truly create a bridge between minds." "The missing children," murmured Anthony. "Ah, that's an exaggeration propagated by small minds like your friend Carl Sanders." Lawrence Jr.'s tone was dismissive. "There were some incidents, yes. Not all human minds are prepared for this type of connection. Some became temporarily disoriented. Others had to be removed for more intensive treatment. But no one disappeared permanently, if that's what worries you." Anthony wasn't convinced. "And why did Mayor Davis abruptly end the experiments?" Lawrence Jr.'s expression hardened momentarily. "Because his son Ernest was one of the subjects who had the most intense reaction. The bond he established with N7 was so strong he began showing unsettling abilities. Jerome Davis was frightened by what he had unleashed and decided to end everything. He opened a drawer and removed a folder. But what old Davis didn't understand is that, once established, the bond cannot simply be broken. It's like an invisible bridge that remains, even when we try to demolish it." Lawrence Jr. opened the folder, revealing recent photographs of Ernest Davis, Dry Creek Valley's current mayor. In the images, the man appeared normal, but in some captured without his knowledge, his eyes had a strangely familiar quality, the same penetrating intensity Anthony recognized in Sheriff's eyes. "Ernest never fully recovered from the bond," Lawrence continued. "For years he tried to suppress the abilities he had acquired, heavily medicating himself, avoiding any contact with animals. But eventually the connection always resurfaces. In recent years, he began having increasingly frequent episodes of, let's say, perception sharing. You mean he sees through animals' eyes? Anthony asked, incredulous. Not just sees, feels what they feel, knows what they know. It's a bidirectional connection. Lawrence Jr. pointed to Sheriff, and N7 is his strongest bond. When my father was forced to end the experiments, he couldn't bring himself to dispose of N7. He knew the animal was too special, unique, so he hid him, keeping him in various locations over the years, protected by trusted people. But how did he get to the livestock fair? And why is he still alive after so much time? Lawrence Jr. sighed. Longevity was an unexpected side effect of the experiments. My father's theory was that by establishing multiple mental bonds, N7 somehow absorbed resistance and vitality characteristics from the human consciousnesses he connected with. As for the fair, he looked at the goat with an enigmatic expression. I suspect it was a deliberate choice of his after his last caretaker died a few months ago. Somehow, N7 knew he needed to find you. Anthony's mind spun with implications. If what Lawrence Jr. was saying was true, then it wasn't coincidence that he had bought the goat at the fair. Somehow the animal had chosen him. Why me? What's special about me? That's the question I've been asking myself. Lawrence Jr. leaned forward, studying Anthony intensely. Since I returned to Dry Creek 5 years ago to continue my father's work, I've been looking for people with potential to establish strong bonds. I've tested dozens of volunteers, but none showed the type of affinity my father found in the original subjects, and then you appear guided by N7. He let the sentence hang like an unformed question. Sheriff moved at that moment, approaching Anthony and resting his head on his knee. The gesture, surprisingly affectionate for a usually reserved animal, made Anthony remember something his father used to say. There are things in this land that we choose, and things that choose us. You said Mayor Davis has perception-sharing episodes. Does that mean he could be watching us now? Through N7? Lawrence Jr. shook his head. It's not that simple. The connection requires certain triggers, certain mental states. And in recent years, Ernest has worked hard to block these episodes. He fears what he might see, what he might discover about himself. He paused, thoughtful. But he also fears what I might discover. Because you see, Mr. Silva, Ernest Davis has his own secrets buried, literally, in this town. Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of secrets? My father's experiments officially ended in 1975. But Ernest, even after adulthood, even after becoming mayor like his father, never stopped investigating what had happened to him. His obsession led him to conduct his own studies. Lawrence Jr. opened another drawer and removed a cassette tape, identical to those Anthony had found in the underground laboratory. This is a recording of a private session Ernest conducted 10 years ago with a local child who showed similar sensitivity to what he had. The recording came to me through a former assistant to the mayor who was disturbed by what he witnessed. He inserted the tape into a recorder on the desk and pressed play. The recording began with static, followed by Ernest Davis's unmistakable voice, younger, but still with that authoritative tone Anthony knew from political speeches. Session 17 with Subject M. Today we're going to try direct contact without animal intermediaries. Focus on the photograph, M. Tell me what you see beyond it. A childish voice, hesitant, responded, I see water, lots of water. And tall trees, a wet place, someone is digging, burying something. Good, very good. Ernest's voice sounded almost feverish. Who's digging? Can you see the face? It's you, sir. But different. Younger. A tense silence, then Ernest spoke again. What am I burying, Em? Focus, it's important. A groan of mental effort, then a box. It has papers inside and something else, something that shines. Where is this place, Em? Do you recognize it? It's near the old well, at the edge of the woods going to the river. Ernest's voice now sounded urgent. This never happened, miss, you understand? What you saw was just your imagination, a dream. The recording ended abruptly. Lawrence Jr. looked at Anthony, whose face had paled. Ernest is desperate to keep buried what happened during the original experiments, the scientist said. Not just out of fear of what the public would think, but because he himself fears his abilities, fears what he has become. And what has he become? Anthony asked, his voice barely a whisper. An anomaly. A human being capable of perceptions that transcend normal consciousness boundaries, something that is not entirely human nor entirely something else. Lawrence Jr. pointed to Sheriff. And this bond, this bridge between species, is the key to understanding the next stage of consciousness evolution. It's my life's work, as it was my father's. Anthony observed the goat, who stared back with those ancient, wise eyes. A disturbing thought began to form in his mind. The other experimental animals, you said they were sacrificed, but what about the children? What happened to the other children besides Ernest? Lawrence Jr.'s face closed into a cautious expression. That, Mr. Silver, is the question Ernest Davis most fears anyone will ask, and it's precisely why N7 chose you. He stood up slowly. Come with me. There's something you need to see to fully understand what's at stake here. The harsh desert sun was already beginning its descent on the horizon when Anthony, Lawrence Jr., and Sheriff left the old train station. The scientist suggested they take his own car, a dusty black Jeep, parked behind the station, protected from curious eyes by a row of withered trees. Where are we going? Anthony asked tensely, while watching Sheriff settle comfortably in the back seat, as if he had made this trip countless times before. To the location mentioned in the recording, Lawrence Jr. responded, maneuvering the vehicle onto a secondary road that skirted the town. The old well at the edge of the woods going to the river. The road became increasingly precarious as they moved away from town, eventually turning into little more than a trail through the sparse, thorn-filled vegetation typical of the desert. After about 20 minutes, Lawrence stopped the Jeep in the shade of a large mesquite tree, one of the few truly leafy trees in the region. We'll have to go the rest of the way on foot, he announced, turning off the engine. Anthony got out of the vehicle apprehensively. Although they were still technically on the outskirts of Dry Creek Valley, the location seemed isolated enough that no one would hear a call for help. A disturbing thought crossed his mind. What if this was all a trap? What if Lawrence Jr. had brought him here to silence him, to prevent him from discovering something that should remain hidden? As if reading his thoughts, Sheriff approached, gently rubbing his head against his leg in an almost comforting gesture. The contact with the animal brought a strange sense of calm, momentarily dispelling his suspicions. N7 trusts you, Lawrence commented, observing the interaction. And he has excellent character judgment. The three followed a nearly invisible trail through the vegetation, with Sheriff frequently taking the lead, as if knowing the path perfectly. After several minutes of walking, they reached a clearing, where a stone well covered by a rotting wooden lid stood solitary amid the wilderness. The wishing. Well, Lawrence Jr. said, approaching the old structure. At least that's what the children called it in the 70s. They said if you threw a coin and made a wish, it would come true. But there was a condition. You had to look into the bottom of the well while making the wish. And what was the trick? Anthony asked, wondering where this story would lead. There was no trick, not in the conventional sense. Lawrence carefully removed the well's lid. But there's something special about this place, something my father discovered, and that Ernest, years later, rediscovered. The well was dry, its earthen bottom visible in the waning daylight. It didn't seem different from any other abandoned well, except that its inner walls were covered with strange inscriptions, symbols Anthony didn't recognize, mixed with childish drawings faded by time. The children from the original experiment left their marks here, Lawrence explained, pointing to the inscriptions. My father believed this place naturally amplified mental connections, something related to the local electromagnetic field, perhaps. Or, as he preferred to think, a thin membrane between our reality and something beyond. Anthony felt an involuntary shiver. And what exactly do you want to show me here? In response, Lawrence Jr. removed a small flashlight from his pocket and threw it to the bottom of the well. The light illuminated an area that at first glance appeared to be just compacted earth. But when Anthony looked more carefully, he noticed there was something there. the outline of a square door, level with the ground. An entrance to the tunnel network, Lawrence said, observing Anthony's reaction. Tunnels that connect various key points in the town, including the laboratory at your farm, the train station, and the city hall itself. An underground network built more than 50 years ago that very few people know about. Why are we here? Anthony insisted, increasingly uncomfortable with the mysteries and half-revelations. Because this is where everything begins to make sense. Lawrence pointed to Sheriff, who had approached the edge of the well and was staring fixedly downward. N7 always returns to this place. It's like an anchor point for him. As if responding to the comment, the goat began emitting a low, guttural sound unlike any vocalization Anthony had ever heard him make. The sound echoed strangely inside the well, creating a reverberation that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but within Anthony's own body. And then, something extraordinary happened. For a brief moment, Anthony's vision seemed to unfold, as if he were seeing through two pairs of eyes simultaneously. He saw himself and Lawrence Jr. from Sheriff's viewpoint, two men at the edge of a well, one confused, the other expectant. But he also saw something more, flashes of memories that weren't his. Children gathered around the well, some laughing, others crying. An older man, whom he recognized as the original Dr. Lawrence from the photographs he'd seen, guiding them in some kind of ritual or experiment. And Sheriff, younger, but with the same penetrating eyes, watching everything, his animal consciousness strangely expanded, absorbing and connecting to the young minds around him. The vision lasted only a few seconds before dissipating, leaving Anthony disoriented and gasping, leaning on the well's edge to avoid falling. "You saw it, didn't you?" Lawrence Jr.'s voice sounded distant, like in a dream. "You experienced the bond." What was that? Anthony tried to catch his breath, his mind struggling to process what he had just experienced. A memory. Not yours, not mine, not even entirely N7's. A collective memory preserved in the bond connecting all who participated in the original experiments. The scientist seemed almost reverent. "My father theorized that under certain conditions, memories could be transferred through the bond, just like perceptions." It seems he was right. Anthony looked at Sheriff, who watched him with renewed intensity, as if evaluating his reaction to what he had just shared. Those children, what happened to them after the experiments ended? Most lived their lives normally, without clear memories of what had happened. Their young brains suppressed the traumatic experiences, turning them into vague dreams or childhood fantasies. Lawrence paused. But some, those who formed stronger bonds, never completely forgot. They carried the marks of the experiments, sometimes manifesting strange abilities in moments of extreme stress, like Ernest Davis. Exactly. He was the most successful case, if we can use that term. His bond with N7 was the deepest, the most complete. Lawrence pointed to the bottom of the well. And that's why he returned here years later, to bury evidence that could reveal his connection to the experiments, documents, recordings, and something else, something even I don't know what it is. Anthony remembered the recording they had listened to at the station, the child's voice mentioning something that shines being buried near the well. If he buried something here, why don't we simply dig and find out what it is? Lawrence smiled bitterly. Because we don't know exactly where it is. The child in the recording, Subject M, said only near the well, which could mean anywhere within a radius of hundreds of yards, and also because he hesitated. Because trying to find those objects directly could alert Ernest. What do you mean? The bond works both ways, remember. If we get too close to what he hid, there's a possibility that N7 might react instinctively, and that reaction could be felt by Ernest, activating his latent connection. Anthony looked at the goat, who now seemed restless, moving nervously around the well. You're saying Sheriff could unintentionally alert Ernest about what we're doing? Precisely. That's why we need to be cautious. Lawrence turned to the animal. N7 is trying to help, in his way. He brought you to me because he knows I need help to complete my father's work. But he also has a connection with Ernest that can't simply be ignored. A disturbing thought arose in Anthony's mind. If this bond is so powerful, Why hasn't Ernest used it to locate Sheriff all these years? Why allow the animal to remain hidden? Lawrence Jr. His expression darkened. Because Ernest fears the bond as much as he desires it. He fears what he might discover about himself if he fully immersed in the connection. He paused significantly, and he fears what N7 might reveal about what really happened to some of those children. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of wind through the withered trees and Sheriff's occasional restless bleats. "There's one more thing you need to know," Lawrence finally said. "Something I discovered recently that completely changed my understanding of my father's work." He took from his pocket a small electronic device, approximately the size of a cell phone, but with a larger screen and several lights blinking on its surface. "This is a brainwave detector I developed to measure N7's neural activity during bonding episodes." He turned on the device, which immediately began emitting a soft, rhythmic beep. "What I discovered is that when N7 establishes a deep bond, like the one you just experienced, his brain activity doesn't just increase, it transforms." The device's screen showed waves and patterns Anthony couldn't interpret, but which clearly excited the scientist. "Transforms how?" he asked, intrigued despite his apprehension. "Into something that shouldn't be possible in an animal brain, patterns resembling—" Lawrence hesitated, as if fearing to speak the words. "Human brain activity, not just any activity, but specific patterns like individual neural signatures. Are you saying Sheriff has human minds inside him?" "Not exactly inside him. It's more like he's become a conductor, a vessel for consciousnesses that somehow detached from their original bodies during the experiments." Lawrence's eyes gleamed with feverish intensity. "My father was right. The bond wasn't just a momentary connection. It was a bridge that allowed transfer of consciousness aspects from one being to another." Anthony felt a chill down his spine looking at Sheriff, who watched him with those ancient, wise eyes. How many minds, how many partial consciousnesses might be housed in that animal body? And how did this affect Sheriff himself? "Why are you telling me all this?" he finally asked, realizing there was an agenda behind Lawrence's revelations. "What do you want from me?" The scientist put away the device and looked at Anthony directly. "Because N7 chose you, and I've learned to trust his judgment, and because I need someone who has access to your own farm where the original laboratory is. There's equipment, records, and samples there that are crucial to my research." "And what's the ultimate goal of this research?" Anthony insisted, still suspicious. "To complete my father's work, not just understand the bonds, but learn to control them, to utilize them. Imagine the possibilities. Direct communication between species, knowledge transfer without intermediaries, perhaps even, preservation of consciousness beyond the physical body's life." The ambition in Lawrence's words was palpable, almost feverish. Anthony realized he was facing a man consumed by the same obsession that had driven his father decades before. An obsession that had already caused suffering and left deep scars in Dry Creek Valley. "And if I refuse to help you?" he asked, keeping his voice firm despite his nervousness. Lawrence Jr.'s eyes hardened momentarily. "Then I'll have to find someone else. Someone who might not have your scruples or your concern for N7's welfare." He paused significantly. "And of course, I'll have to ensure that what you already know doesn't become a problem." The veiled threat didn't go unnoticed. Anthony looked at Sheriff, who seemed agitated, moving nervously from side to side. "And what happens to him? To Sheriff?" "N7 is central to my research. Always has been." Lawrence's voice softened slightly. "But I understand you've developed an attachment to the animal. I can guarantee he'll be well treated." Before Anthony could respond, Sheriff let out a sharp bleat and began quickly moving, away from the well toward the trail they'd come by. His posture was tense, alert, as if he'd detected something disturbing. "What's happening?" Anthony asked, alarmed by the sudden change in the animal's behavior. Lawrence's face paled. He sensed something, or someone. The scientist looked around, suddenly nervous. "We need to leave. Now." Hastily, he replaced the lid on the well and began following Sheriff down the trail. Anthony hesitated for a moment before following them, his mind filled with unanswered questions and growing concerns. Who or what could have frightened Sheriff? And more importantly, what choice would he make now that he knew part of the truth about the experiments and his mysterious goat? Helping Lawrence Jr. meant possibly contributing to something dangerous and unethical. Refusing could put him at risk, and perhaps Sheriff too. As he hurried his pace to catch up with the other two, Anthony realized he was no longer just a curious bystander. He had become part of Dry Creek Valley's enigma, an enigma that seemed to grow deeper and more disturbing with each new revelation. The return to town was tense and silent. Lawrence Jr. drove with his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror, as if fearing he was being followed. Sheriff remained agitated in the back seat, his alert eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. Anthony watched both, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and unanswered questions. When they finally reached the entrance to Dry Creek Valley, the sun had already set completely, leaving the small town immersed in the twilight's dimness. Lawrence parked the jeep in the same wooded area near the abandoned station. "I'll leave you here," he said, turning off the engine. "Your pickup is still parked on the other side of the station. It's better we're not seen together in town." Anthony nodded, still processing everything he'd discovered on that extraordinary day. "And Sheriff? N7 will go with you for now." Lawrence looked at the goat in the rearview mirror. "He chose you after all, and it seems he still has something to show you." "How will I know who to trust?" Anthony asked, hesitant. "You yourself said Ernest Davis and others in town might be involved in the experiments or cover-up." Lawrence Jr. took a small card from his pocket and handed it to Anthony. "This is my number. Use it only in emergencies, and never from a phone that can be traced." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. "As for trust N7, he has an almost infallible instinct for distinguishing allies from threats." Anthony pocketed the card, a growing sense of discomfort in his chest. He was being dragged into something bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined when he bought that skinny goat at the fair. "What happens now?" he asked, needing some direction amid so much chaos. "Return to your farm. Continue your normal routine. Don't arouse suspicion." Lawrence looked significantly at Sheriff. "And pay attention to the signals N7 gives you. He'll guide you to the next step." With those enigmatic words, Lawrence indicated the conversation was over. Anthony got out of the jeep, opening the back door for Sheriff to follow. The goat jumped, agilely and immediately positioned itself beside Anthony, like a vigilant guard dog. "We'll be in touch soon," Lawrence said before starting the engine. "Be prepared." The jeep quickly disappeared into the dark road, leaving Anthony alone with Sheriff and a million unanswered questions. They walked silently to the parked pickup, the desert night falling rapidly around them, bringing its blanket of bright stars and a silence that seemed loaded with secrets. During the return journey to the farm, Anthony tried to organize his thoughts. The story that had begun with the simple purchase of a goat at the fair had transformed into a complex web involving questionable scientific experiments, possibly traumatized children, and a mayor with inexplicable abilities. Lawrence Jr. clearly had his own agenda, but was it as dangerous as his father's? And what role did Sheriff, or N7 as Lawrence called him, expect him to play in all this? Upon arriving at the farm, he found Joshua waiting anxiously on the porch, a worried expression on his young face. "Mr. Anthony, thank God you're back," the boy exclaimed, running to meet the pickup. "Something strange happened while you were away." Anthony felt a knot in his stomach. "What happened?" "Joshua. Mayor Davis was here with two men I've never seen before. He said he needed to talk to you urgently about an issue related to overdue property taxes." Anthony frowned. His taxes were current, despite financial difficulties. It was a transparent excuse for something else. "What did you tell them? That you'd gone to town to buy supplies and should be back soon?" Joshua hesitated. But they didn't seem to believe much. They were here for almost an hour, looking around the property. One of them was especially interested in the old barn. The barn where the entrance to the underground laboratory was. Anthony felt a chill. "Did they enter the barn?" "They tried, but I said it was about to collapse, that it was dangerous. Even so, I saw one of them snooping around there when they thought I wasn't looking." Anthony exchanged a significant look with Sheriff, who seemed to understand perfectly the gravity of the situation. "You did well, Joshua." He got out of the pickup, followed by the goat. "You can go home now. We'll talk more tomorrow." "Are you sure, Mr. Anthony? I can stay if you need help. I'm sure it's already late. Your mother must be worried." After Joshua left, reluctant but obedient, Anthony headed to the old barn, with Sheriff following closely. He needed to check if the entrance to the laboratory remained hidden, if the unwanted visitors had discovered anything. To his relief, the trapdoor remained concealed under the planks, apparently untouched, but he couldn't be certain they hadn't noticed signs of recent disturbance in the area. Davis's men might return, perhaps with equipment for a more thorough search. "We're at a crossroads, aren't we, Sheriff?" murmured Anthony, absently petting the animal's head. "If we stay, we're at risk. If we run, where would we go?" The goat looked at him with those ancient, wise eyes, and Anthony wondered again what consciousnesses resided behind that animal gaze. How many children had connected to Sheriff during the experiments? Did their minds, or fragments of them, still exist somehow in the expanded consciousness of the animal? Back at the house, Anthony prepared a simple dinner while considering his options. He could surrender everything to Carl Sanders, the ex-cop who already suspected past events. But would Carl be trustworthy, or have his own connections to the cover-up? He could accept Lawrence Jr.'s proposal and help him in his research, but that would mean possibly contributing to ethically questionable experiments. Or he could try to solve the mystery on his own, using the clues Sheriff provided, but that would put him on a direct collision course with powerful people in town. After dinner, he sat on the porch with the tapes he'd found in the underground laboratory. Using an old recorder that had belonged to his father, he began listening to the recordings. They were records of bonding sessions, experiments in which Dr. Lawrence tried to establish and strengthen the mental connection between Sheriff and the participating children. The scientist's clinical, distant voice contrasted with the children's voices, sometimes excited, sometimes frightened by what they experienced. In one of the sessions, a girl described how she could see through the goat's eyes and feel his thoughts. In another, a boy reported sensations of disorientation and identity confusion after prolonged bonding sessions. The most disturbing recording, however, came from the last tape. In it, Dr. Lawrence discussed with a man Anthony recognized by the authoritative voice as Jerome Davis, the former mayor. "The results are extraordinary, Jerome," Lawrence said, enthusiastic. "The connection went beyond any expectation. Subject F not only established a temporary bond, but seems to have developed a permanent connection with Experiment 7. "That's precisely what worries me, Robert," Davis replied, his voice tense. "My son has been different since the last session. He has nightmares, says strange things, acts as if he can perceive things that aren't there. They're just initial adjustments. His brain is adapting to new forms of perception. It's perfectly normal in this stage of the experiment." "Normal? He told me yesterday he could see what the goat was seeing, even while at home. That's not normal, Robert. It's an abomination." A tense silence, then Lawrence's voice, more contained. "We need to continue, Jerome. We're on the verge of a revolutionary discovery. If we stop now, all the work, all the progress will be lost. I don't care about your progress. This is about my son and about the other children. Parents are starting to ask questions. Rumors are circulating in town. You know how to handle rumors. You've been doing it for years. This time it's different. People are disappearing, Robert. Children who participated in your experiment and then simply didn't come home. Accidents happen during pioneering research. You've always understood that. Accidents, is that what you call it? I'm ending the funding, Robert. The laboratory will be closed by the end of the week. The animals sacrificed, and you'll leave Dry Creek and never come back." The recording ended abruptly there. Anthony turned off the recorder, feeling nauseated. The implications were clear and disturbing. Not only had children been used as guinea pigs, but some of them possibly hadn't survived the experiments. And one of them, Ernest Davis, had developed a permanent connection with Sheriff, a connection that apparently persisted to this day. While reflecting on these somber revelations, Anthony noticed Sheriff watching him from the porch door. The animal seemed tense, its ears erect, catching sounds Anthony couldn't perceive. "What is it, Sheriff? Did you hear something?" In response, the goat moved quickly toward the back of the house, looking repeatedly over his shoulder as if wanting Anthony to follow. With a foreboding of urgency, Anthony secured the tapes in a bag and followed the animal. Sheriff guided him to the property's boundaries, where cultivated land gave way to native desert vegetation. There, under the silvery moonlight, Anthony saw what had alarmed the goat: headlights of vehicles approaching on the secondary road leading to the farm. "Damn, they're back," he murmured, instinctively crouching down. There were 2 cars, advancing, slowly with low beams, clearly trying not to draw attention. Anthony recognized one as the City Hall's official car. "We need to get out of here, Sheriff," he whispered, realizing they wouldn't have time to return to the house to get supplies or documents. The goat was already moving, heading to the small grove growing at the back of the property, the same place where he'd found the buried box days before. Anthony followed him, carrying only the bag with the tapes and Lawrence's diary from his pocket. As they penetrated the vegetation, they heard voices approaching the house. Crouching among the bushes, they saw lights being turned on inside the residence and figures moving around the property. "Check the barn and sheds," ordered a voice Anthony recognized as Ernest Davis. "He can't have gone far, and remember, I want both the man and the animal alive and unharmed." Anthony felt a chill. The mayor wasn't just looking for evidence of old experiments, he was specifically hunting him and Sheriff. The goat gently nudged him with his muzzle, indicating they should continue moving. Silently, they moved farther from the house, using the night's darkness and vegetation cover to hide their escape. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, Anthony found himself in an area of the woods he didn't recognize. Sheriff, however, seemed to know exactly where they were going, advancing with purpose and confidence through the thorny vegetation. "Where are we going, Sheriff?" Anthony whispered, more to himself than expecting an answer. To his surprise, the goat stopped and turned to him. His eyes, reflecting moonlight, seemed to convey a clear message: trust. Anthony felt a strange sense of calm spread through his body, as if something or someone was trying to communicate that everything would be all right. It was at that moment, alone in the dark woods with only a mysterious goat as company, fleeing from powerful men determined to find him, that Anthony Silver made his decision. He wouldn't help Lawrence Jr. in his obsession to continue his father's experiments. He wouldn't surrender to Ernest Davis and his men. Instead, he would discover the complete truth about what had happened in Dry Creek Valley decades ago, and would do whatever necessary to ensure justice was served. Looking at Sheriff, who watched him patiently in the darkness, Anthony made a silent promise. He would protect the animal and the consciousnesses possibly residing within him. He would find a way to expose the truth without causing more harm. And perhaps he would find a way to free those who had been trapped in a bond they never asked to form. With this firm resolution in mind, he followed Sheriff deeper into the night, leaving behind the life he knew toward an uncertain but inevitable destiny. Dawn found Anthony and Sheriff sheltered in a small natural cave, formed by erosion on a rocky cliff. They were exhausted after hours of nocturnal walking through the desert's thorny vegetation. Anthony's hands and arms were scratched, his sore muscles protested with every movement, but there was a renewed determination in his eyes. "We need a plan, Sheriff," he said to the goat, who rested calmly beside him. "We can't just keep running forever." The animal raised its head, its intelligent eyes fixed on Anthony, as if perfectly understanding the gravity of the situation. In the few days since he'd bought him at the fair, Anthony had grown accustomed to treating Sheriff as something more than a simple animal. Now, knowing what he knew about the experiments and the bond, this impression intensified. He wasn't just talking to a goat, but possibly to fragments of human consciousnesses preserved within him. "If you could speak, I bet you'd have a lot to say, wouldn't you?" he murmured, extending his hand to stroke the animal's coarse fur. The moment his fingers touched Sheriff, something extraordinary happened. Like at the well, his perception seemed to unfold, but this time with much more intensity. He was no longer just seeing through the goat's eyes. he was experiencing memories, emotions, and thoughts that weren't his. He saw himself as a child, watching with fascination and fear as Dr. Lawrence approached with a young goat, Sheriff. He felt the initial confusion, the fear, and then the strange sensation of expansion when minds began to connect. He experienced the panic when the connection intensified too much, when the boundary between human self and animal began to dissolve. And finally, he felt the traumatic moment of transfer, when something essential from the child flowed into the animal, leaving behind only a confused and incomplete shell. The vision changed, and now it was a young Ernest Davis experiencing his bond with Sheriff different from the others, stronger, more controlled, but also deeper. He saw how the mayor's son secretly returned to the laboratory, even after official experiments had ended, seeking to re-establish that connection that, despite frightening, offered powers and perceptions that fascinated him. The images continued to flow, Sheriff being hidden by Lawrence when the laboratory was closed, years passing while the animal was kept in various secure locations by loyal assistants. Lawrence Jr., as a rival, determined to continue his father's work. And finally, Sheriff's conscious decision to escape, to seek someone who could help resolve what had begun decades ago. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Anthony breathless, and disoriented, fallen to his knees on the cave's rough earth. Sheriff stood before him, his eyes fixed on his as if waiting for a reaction. "My God, Sheriff," Anthony whispered, his voice trembling. "You carry within you the consciousnesses of children who couldn't fully return from the experiments. You're a guardian of lost souls." The goat tilted its head as if nodding. Anthony then realized it hadn't been an accident, the vision he'd just had. Sheriff had deliberately shared those memories, those truths, using the bond that somehow was also forming between them. "That's why you chose me at the fair. You needed someone who could help free these consciousnesses, didn't you? Someone who could expose the truth about what happened." Again, that feeling of assent, of confirmation. Anthony felt an enormous responsibility weigh on his shoulders. It was no longer just about discovering the truth or protecting Sheriff. It was about bringing justice and perhaps peace to those who had been victims of Lawrence's experiments. He began mentally organizing what he knew. The laboratory on his farm contained evidence of the original experiments. The old train station harbored the continuation of research by Lawrence Jr. The well on the outskirts of town was an amplification point for the bond. And somewhere, probably near that well, Ernest Davis had buried crucial evidence that could incriminate him. "We need to go back to the well," Anthony decided, rising with renewed determination. "That's where everything began, and that's where we'll find what Davis hid. But how to get there without being detected? By now, Ernest Davis would have mobilized considerable resources to find them. Little Dry Creek Valley didn't offer many hiding places. It was then Anthony remembered the tunnels mentioned by Lawrence Jr., the underground network connecting key points in town, including the laboratory on his farm. If they could enter this network, they could move without being seen. "We need to go back to the farm, Sheriff. At least close enough to access the entrance in the laboratory." The goat seemed to hesitate, clearly worried about the risk. "I know it's dangerous, but we have no other option. They won't expect us to go back there so soon." They waited until nightfall before moving again. Under night's cover, they cautiously approached the farm, staying in shadows and avoiding open areas. As Anthony suspected, there were men watching the property, 2 guards positioned near the main house, and a vehicle parked close to the old barn. "Damn," murmured Anthony, observing the scene from behind a thicket. "How are we going to get past them?" Sheriff nudged him gently and began moving around the property's perimeter, following a path Anthony had never noticed before. Understanding the animal's plan, he followed silently. The path led them to an area behind the old barn, where vegetation grew denser. There, partially hidden by thorny bushes, was a small stone construction. Anthony had never seen. It looked like a sort of ancient well or cistern, much older than his own occupation of the farm. Sheriff indicated the structure with a head movement. Anthony examined it carefully and discovered the rotting wooden lid could be removed with some effort. Underneath, a metal ladder descended into darkness, similar to the one they'd found in the barn. "Another entrance to the tunnels," he whispered, amazed at the extent of the underground network. With extreme care not to make noise, they descended the rusty stairs. Anthony had improvised a torch using a dry branch and his lighter, providing limited but sufficient illumination to navigate the narrow tunnels. The underground system was more extensive than Anthony had imagined. Concrete corridors branched in various directions, some partially blocked by collapses, others surprisingly well preserved. Markings on walls faded by time offered some orientation. Lab, Stay, SQ, Well, abbreviations for connected destinations. "Well must be the well, right?" murmured Anthony, more to himself than to Sheriff. They followed the marked passage, advancing slowly in the dim light. The air was heavy and humid, smelling of wet earth and mold. Occasionally they heard disturbing noises, the trickling of water, the scratching of small animals, and sometimes more disturbing sounds that seemed almost human. After what seemed like hours of walking, they reached stairs leading up to a circular trapdoor. Anthony hesitated. "This must lead to the well or near it, but we don't know what we'll find up there." Sheriff looked at him with those penetrating eyes, conveying a sense of urgency. Anthony understood the message. They'd come too far to turn back now. Carefully, he climbed the first steps and gently pushed the trapdoor. It was heavy but not locked. Opening it just enough to peek out, he saw they had emerged in a small abandoned building a few yards from the well, probably an old tool shed. The place seemed deserted. High moon illuminated the clearing, revealing the solitary well in the center and sparse vegetation around. Anthony signaled to Sheriff, and both cautiously emerged from the underground hideout. "Now we need to find exactly where Davis buried the evidence," Anthony said, looking around. "The child in the recording said, 'near the well.' But that could be in any direction." Sheriff began circling the well, his muzzle close to the ground as if sniffing something. Suddenly he stopped and began frantically digging at a specific point about 30 feet from the well toward town. Anthony joined him, using his hands to remove the hardened earth. After several minutes of excavation, his fingers found something solid. A metal box, very similar to the one Sheriff had found on his property days before. With racing heart, Anthony removed the box from the earth. It was heavier than expected and had no lock, just a simple latch that had been sealed with some type of resin, now dry and brittle. Breaking the seal with a rock, Anthony opened the box. Inside, he found official documents bearing the city, Hall stamp, dated 1975 and signed by Jerome Davis. They were direct orders for closing Lawrence's laboratory, destroying all experiment records, and silencing, through threats or bribes, anyone who mentioned the occurred events. There were also photographs, disturbing images of children during bonding sessions, their faces contorted in expressions of confusion and pain. In several of them, Ernest Davis appeared as one of the subjects, connected to Sheriff through strange devices attached to their temples. But the most surprising item was a small metal device, the size of a matchbox, with a red button and a weakly blinking light even after so many years. What is this?" murmured Anthony, examining the object with curiosity. The answer came not from Sheriff, but from a voice behind them. "It's an emergency transmitter, designed by my father to activate or deactivate the bond in critical situations." Anthony turned sharply to find Lawrence Jr. standing at the clearing's entrance, a grave expression on his face. "How did you find us?" Anthony asked, instinctively positioning himself between the scientist and Sheriff. "I didn't find you. I knew you'd come here eventually." Lawrence approached slowly. "N7 always returns to this place. It's the anchor point for the bond." "What do you mean?" "This is where the first complete transfer experiment happened." Lawrence gestured to the well. "That child, the first to establish a bond too deep, was playing near this well when it happened. The partial transfer of his consciousness to N7. Anthony felt a chill down his spine. "Was this an accident?" "Originally, yes. My father didn't expect the bond could become so strong." Lawrence looked at Sheriff with a difficult-to-decipher expression. But then, when he realized what had happened, he tried to replicate the phenomenon voluntarily. "Voluntarily? Are you saying he deliberately transferred children's consciousnesses to an animal. He saw it as an extraordinary scientific advancement, a way to transcend physical body limitations. Lawrence extended his hand. "May I see the device?" Anthony hesitated, unsure whether to trust the man. "What exactly does it do?" "It was designed as a safety measure. If the bond became dangerously strong, the device could temporarily interrupt it, allowing the transferred consciousness to return to its original body." Lawrence took a step forward. "But it could also theoretically do the opposite, strengthen the bond to the point of making the transfer permanent." "Is that what your father did? Made the transfers permanent?" "Not intentionally. When Jerome Davis ordered the laboratory closed, my father tried to use the device to reverse the deepest bonds, to return the consciousnesses to their bodies." Lawrence paused significantly. "But something went wrong. Instead of reversing the process, the device intensified it. The consciousnesses became trapped in N7, unable to return completely." The revelation hit Anthony like a punch. The visions, the memories he'd experienced through Sheriff, they were fragments of real children trapped in a consciousness limbo for decades. And Ernest Davis? Why didn't he get trapped like the others? His bond was different, stronger but also more controlled. He managed to maintain his primary consciousness in his own body, but the connection never broke completely. Lawrence took another step forward. That's why he fears and desires N7 at the same time. Part of him is in the animal, and part of the animal is in him. A motor noise interrupted the conversation. Headlights illuminated the nearby vegetation, announcing the arrival of vehicles. "Davis," murmured Lawrence, suddenly tense. "We must go. Now." "I don't trust you," Anthony said firmly, holding the device and found documents. "Your interest in this story is as obsessive as your father's. How do I know you don't just want to continue the experiments?" Lawrence stared at him for a long moment. "Because, unlike my father, I've seen the long-term results. I've seen the suffering it caused." His voice trembled slightly. "One of the children from the experiments was my younger sister. Part of her is still trapped in N7, unable to move on or return completely." The engine growl grew closer. There was no more time for discussions or doubts. "Come with me," Lawrence urged. "I know another way out of here, but we need to go now." Anthony hesitated only for a second before nodding. With the documents and device firmly secured, he followed Lawrence and Sheriff away from the clearing, seconds before the headlights illuminated the spot they'd just left. They ran through the vegetation, guided by the moon's weak light and Sheriff's apparent innate knowledge of the terrain. Behind them, raised voices indicated they'd been spotted. "There." Lawrence pointed to a low structure, almost completely hidden by bushes. "Another entrance to the tunnels." They quickly descended the trapdoor, closing it above their heads while the footsteps of their pursuers approached. In the tunnels' darkness, Lawrence turned on a small flashlight he carried. "This path leads directly out of town," he explained, guiding them through a narrow corridor. It was built as an escape route in case the experiments were discovered. They advanced rapidly through the dark tunnels, the sound of their breathing echoing off concrete walls. Above them, footsteps and voices indicated their pursuers still searched for them, but with each minute the distance increased. "What do you plan to do with the evidence?" Lawrence asked while they navigated around a partial collapse in the tunnel. "Expose the truth," Anthony responded firmly. "Reveal what happened to those children. Bring justice." "It's not that simple." Lawrence slowed down, his voice becoming graver. "Public exposure could cause more harm than good. The families, the entire town would be affected. And what about the consciousnesses trapped in N7? Exposing everything without a plan to help them would be cruel." Anthony considered the words. There was truth in them. He couldn't simply throw the whole story to the world and expect everything to resolve itself. "And the device?" he asked, referring to the small metal object they'd found. "You said it. Intensified the bond accidentally. Could it do the opposite now, free the consciousnesses?" "Theoretically, yes." Lawrence seemed cautiously optimistic. "Over the past years, I've studied my father's work intensively, trying to understand where he went wrong. I believe that, with the right settings, the device could help undo the permanent bonds. But where would these consciousnesses go? Anthony looked at Sheriff, who walked silently beside him. The original bodies no longer exist or are. Adults now. That's the most delicate part. Lawrence stopped when they reached a fork in the tunnels. The consciousnesses would need new receptacles or would have to be completely released to move on. The implication hung heavily between them. Freeing the consciousnesses could mean allowing them to finally find peace, but it would also mean a form of definitive loss. Sheriff emitted a soft sound, almost a human sigh. His eyes, reflecting the flashlight's weak light, fixed on Anthony with moving intensity. "He's trying to say something," murmured Anthony. "Touch him," Lawrence suggested. "The bond between you two is growing. Perhaps you can perceive what he wants to communicate." Hesitant, Anthony placed his hand on the goat's head. Immediately he felt that strange consciousness expansion, but this time it didn't come as a chaotic flow of memories. It was a clear message, almost like words formed directly in his mind. "Free us, we're tired, we want to rest." Anthony removed his hand, deeply shaken by the communication's clarity. "They want to be freed," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "They're tired of existing in this limbo." Lawrence nodded solemnly. "It's what I suspected. After so long trapped between worlds, these consciousnesses long for closure, for peace." They continued through the right tunnel, which began to slope gradually upward. After several more minutes of walking, they reached another ladder leading to a trapdoor. "We're at the town limits, near the road leading to the capital," Lawrence informed. "My car is hidden not far from here." Emerging cautiously, they found themselves in a deserted area, the town visible only as a set of distant lights. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, announcing dawn's approach. "What now?" Anthony asked, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "We need to reach a safe place where we can properly use the device. I have a small but well-equipped laboratory on the capital's outskirts." Lawrence looked at Sheriff. "But first we need to decide what to do with the evidence we found." Anthony thought of the photographs, the official documents incriminating not only the original Dr. Lawrence, but also Jerome Davis and, by extension, his son, Ernest. "The evidence is our only protection," he said finally, "and the only way to ensure something like this never happens again in Dry Creek Valley." They walked in silence until reaching Lawrence's vehicle, hidden under a cover of dry branches. During the journey to the capital, Anthony watched Sheriff in the back seat, sleeping peacefully, as if, for the first time in decades, at peace with what was to come. 3 days later, Anthony Silver, Raphael Lawrence Jr., and an extraordinarily old goat were gathered in a small laboratory on the capital's outskirts. The place was modest, but equipped with modern technology, a considerable evolution from the improvised laboratory where it all began. The device found in the box had been carefully studied and reconfigured by Lawrence. On a metal table also rested copies of the incriminating documents. The originals had been sent to a trusted lawyer, with instructions to reveal them if anything happened to Anthony or Lawrence. "Are you ready?" Lawrence asked, adjusting the last parameters on the modified device. Anthony looked at Sheriff, who watched him calmly. In the few days they'd spent together, the bond between them had strengthened, allowing increasingly clear communications. Anthony knew without a doubt that the animal and the consciousnesses he harbored were at peace with the decision made. "We're ready," he responded, gently stroking Sheriff's head. Lawrence connected small electrodes to the goat's temples and linked them to the device, now integrated with modern monitoring equipment. "The process should be gradual," he explained. "Too rapid a release could cause permanent damage both to N7 and the consciousnesses he harbors." With precise gestures, Lawrence initiated the procedure. Lights blinked on the device. Charts began forming on the monitor's screens. Sheriff remained, surprisingly calm, his eyes fixed on Anthony, conveying a trust that transcended words. Slowly, something began to change. Anthony first felt it as a slight pressure in the air, then as nearly imperceptible waves of alternating heat and cold. The monitors recorded spikes of brain activity in the goat, complex patterns oscillating between animal and curiously human configurations. "It's working," murmured Lawrence, observing the data with scientific fascination. "The patterns are separating. The consciousnesses are becoming unbound." Anthony didn't need the monitors to know what was happening. He could feel, through the bond he'd developed with Sheriff, the presences slowly detaching, like knots being gently untied. There was sadness in that detachment, but also profound relief, a sense of liberation long awaited. The process continued for almost an hour. Gradually, Sheriff's eyes, those extraordinarily intelligent and ancient eyes, began changing. The supernatural intensity diminished, replaced by something simpler, more purely animal, yet still dignified by the unique experience he'd lived. When Lawrence finally turned off the device, a reverent silence filled the laboratory. Anthony approached Sheriff, now free from the burden he'd carried for so many decades, and gently removed the electrodes from his head. "How is he?" he asked Lawrence, noticing the goat seemed tired but peaceful. "Stable. Brain patterns have returned to normal for an animal of his species." Lawrence reviewed the data one last time. The consciousnesses were successfully released. As for what happened to them after, that's beyond science's ability to measure. Anthony looked out the laboratory window at the clear morning sky. He wasn't a religious man, but in that moment, he felt a deep certainty that those consciousnesses, those children so long trapped in an impossible limbo, had finally found peace. "And Ernest Davis?" he asked, turning to Lawrence. "His connection with Sheriff has also been broken?" "Probably, although his bond was different, more autonomous." Lawrence closed the data files on his computer. But without N7 as an anchor, his abilities should diminish significantly over time. In the months that followed, a discreet but methodical investigation was conducted in Dry Creek Valley. Evidence was presented to state authorities, bypassing Ernest Davis's local power. The mayor resigned before formal accusations were even presented, disappearing from public life into seclusion many attributed to health problems. The complete story never reached national newspapers. A silent agreement ensured affected children's families were compensated without public exposure trauma. The underground laboratory at Anthony's farm was officially sealed after evidence collection, its entrance permanently blocked to prevent future explorations. As for Anthony, he returned to his farm, determined to rebuild it not just as a production site but as a symbol of renewal. The first significant rains in years fell on Dry Creek Valley that autumn, as if the earth could finally breathe again, freed from secrets buried too long. And Sheriff, now just an old but extraordinarily resilient goat, spent his final days peacefully grazing in fields that slowly returned to green, his eyes, though now reflecting only the natural wisdom of an animal that lived well beyond its expected time, still seemed to contemplate the world with a serenity that came from the other side of a finally crossed bridge. On especially clear nights, when Dry Creek Valley's sky filled with stars, Anthony would sit on his rebuilt house's porch, with Sheriff lying peacefully at his feet, and contemplate the mysteries they'd lived through together. Somewhere beyond